Um, today I will be presenting on what I learned during the class about exegeting the Gospels. So, exegeting the Gospels forms a separate genre by itself. The reason being that that I'll shortly be saying. They fall into some kind of a hybrid category. But before that, we all know that the Gospels, there are 4 different Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They will contain both the narratives about Jesus' life and also his sayings. Okay. Oops. So just because there are narratives, do we go about interpreting them as historical books? And since there are sayings, do we go about interpreting them as epistles? Not quite, because they're kind of a hybrid. Now we all know that the Gospels are the only source of knowing about Jesus' earthly ministry. There are sundry quotations that happen in other parts of the Bible, but these are the only authoritative books that talk to us about or teach us about Jesus' life and earthly ministry. And these Gospels are not biographies, as in Jesus didn't write any of them. They are third-party renderings, so to say. Third party is somebody who is not I, not you, but somebody else. So here is Jesus, who is the person we want to know about, and we are the second part trying to know about Jesus. And here is a third party. I mean, these 4 others are outside of you and I, and they are the guys who have written about Jesus. And so. It's a kind of genre that doesn't fit in any of the existing, usual genres. There is another difficulty to it, and the challenge being that the document is not written by. There are 4 different such documents. Usually, if there are biographies, we know that one is more authoritative or more valuable than the rest of them. But here we have 4 of them, 3 sounding very similar. They are called the synoptic gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they all form the authoritative and valuable set of documents, which are all of them are correct, all of them are equally valuable, all of them are authoritative. Yet there are differences in between different renderings, and so that forms the challenge of exegeting the Gospels. Again, just what I quoted, I think I have shuffled around the slides. They're not biographies, though they contain virtually all the biographical information we can know about Jesus today. They're not the kind of contemporary lives of great men kind of genre books, because though they record about the life of the greatest man of all times, there are other parts to it as well. So from the textbook, he kind of quotes Justin Martyr, who says the Gospels are more like the memoirs of apostles. And Justin Martyr happens to be a 2nd century church father. And so, how do you go about exegeting them? We all know that the steps to exegesis is a hard science. Hard science we establish, we irrespective of whether the steps make sense in their smaller steps or not, we just go about with them. And here are the 3 steps: establishing the historical context, establishing the literary context, and then try to interpret the text in the light of these contexts. To establish the historical context, like we have seen earlier, it has 2 levels of context, so to say. There is the historical context around Jesus, who is the subject we are trying to understand, and also the context in which the authors themselves wrote. to understand the historical context of Jesus, there is this general historical context where Jesus lived and did his ministry. Like the example is like the Judaism, the culture around Jesus. They all understood what it means to be baptized. That's a term proud which makes sense only in their particular context. And things like that. And how do we establish them? Of course, there is a general historical context, which is about just the understanding of when Jesus lived. And so, and how do we establish that? We just need to read books on the New Testament times, and the textbook prescribes a bunch of books on those subjects. There is a specific historical context as well. And this is for each specific teachings. And now this is the hard part of interpreting the Gospels, because establishing the specific context in which Jesus said to somebody is either missing completely or available only in small bursts of context. We have heard the word pericopes, which means basically sayings which are passed on by mouth. And there are pronouncement stories which have a little context, like in the example that is quoted is about Jesus concluding that one has to give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and what belongs to God, give it to God. So, I mean, that particular story has a very small context, and so the authors knew that kind of a context existed, but only so much. Not all the sayings had context. In fact, the author goes on to quote this particular thing from Acts, where Paul quotes Jesus saying, "It is blessed to give than to receive." And now we don't find it in any of the Gospels. So others had information, word of mouth passing of the information, and they kind of took it and wrote. And so there is hardly any context there. So how do we deal with lack of specific context for each of the sayings? And one suggestion that the authors of the book give is to kind of try to see try to group different sayings into collections. And he kind of gives an example of Gospel of Matthew giving like 5 different collection of sayings. The Sermon on the Mount, the sermon in chapter 10 when he was about to send out disciples, and so on. And again the apocalyptic sayings in chapter 24 of Matthew. So each of the authors, they kind of selected the information available to them, grouped them together, and then addressed them, showed them as if Jesus is addressing them to a specific group of people. So now the moment we make a collection, we try to understand which group, what did Jesus intend as the audience for those group of collections. Like, for example, is the Sermon on the Mount, is it aimed at close disciples, or is it at large crowds of people? For example, the chapter 13, where he tells a lot of parables. Was it intended at the large crowds? Chapter 24, is it again aimed at his disciples, or the large crowds, or the opponents? These are the things that when we understand, we get an understanding of the context of who Jesus is addressing to, and therefore that kind of forms a very, not an exhaustive context, but a reasonable context to understand and the text of the text that we'll be dealing with. Okay, historical context of Jesus is one part, and now there are others who are writing about Jesus. So there is you can think of them as like cameramen who are looking at the bridegroom, and so there are like 4 different cameramen, and then they are trying to shoot this guy and trying to and they had one particular profile on mind. Not all of them are shooting for a wedding, possibly. Probably one guy is shooting for a legal evidence that Jesus actually, or not Jesus, but somebody is getting married, and probably for somebody else is shooting the same camera for the friend of the bridegroom to show it off as a cool thing. It has nothing to do with the legal documentation, and he's not shot the signature taking part of the ceremony. So context of the author is like that. I mean, Did my timer go off? I'm sorry.
6 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to conclude. So there is a context to the author as well. So author wrote the gospel with a specific audience in mind, and he's writing about Jesus, who was also talking to set of people. So so each of the author kind of selected these different parts of the material and then arranged it together. There are three principles at work. Selectivity, arrangement, and adaptation. Basically, selectivity is about what material to present to these guys. I mean, there are these groups of Christians. Some are Gentile Christians, some are Jewish Christians, and each of these different guys need a different style of writing and different material to be presented. So that's selectivity, and arrangement and adaptation also is about the structure and how he grouped these different information together. So this is the literary context for the gospel. Now we have the historical context and the literal context. How do you go about interpreting? So the author kind of uses two general ways of doing it. He asks us to think horizontally, which means be aware of the parallel passages that are there in the Bible, and and try to understand the whole thing, not to fudge them all together into a single large lump, but to understand and appreciate that there are different groups that are being addressed, and so the different aspects of the saying has come out. For example, the cursing of the fig tree thing. So Mark intends it as a lesson to say that Jesus has also purged the temple, whereas Matthew only shows it as an example for faith. That if somebody has faith like faith and he curses, he can do anything. And then they also suggest thinking vertically, as in be aware of the historical context of both the author and Jesus and try to understand what the text means in that context. And of course, he ends with a word of precaution that unless we understand the principles of the kingdom of God, because that forms the centrality of Jesus' life. Even if we have all the correct tools correctly in place, we will probably not be able to interpret the Gospels correctly. So he kind of says that we have to first start understanding the principles of the kingdom of God, and then do excellence part of it. And of course, okay.
Maybe the question's level of difficulty increases based on people's I think so, I don't know. Just a caution on that. I mean, I would like to just ask in general that was there any passage of the gospel that before you learned this particular principles and ways of interpreting the gospel that you found it difficult, and then after that you kind of figured it out and you were able to kind of get to, now I get to rightly understand. Before I had this wrong understanding of a particular passage or particular section of the gospel. So do you have any such examples?
Like the fig tree example, that was I was able to appreciate that these two guys I have actually written to two different people, and therefore, I mean, on the face of it, when I read Mark and Matthew, there was an obvious difference, and it's hard to explain that both of them are about the same incident and the same fig tree and same audience. But after I read through this, I realized that the audience are different, and the lessons that each of these students are trying to teach their audience are different. And so I was able to appreciate that there are differences, and they don't necessarily need to mean the same lesson as well. So that's one example.
Okay. Yeah, so there the way you are trying to reconcile is the audiences are different one, and if we were to go about to see that the perspective with which they are coming to trying to present that particular situation is different, because the way of what they want to present is adaptability and then selectivity and what is the third one? arrangement. So that helped you a little to kind of figure out. And so we don't have to reconcile the differences always. As a principle that emanates from there is that differences have been let in with an intent of all these things that we are seeing, and we don't have to reconcile the differences, but read in its context of historical and then literary context so as to get to the what author is trying to say. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Well, Suman, thank you for your presentation. It's really good. I just want all of us to think one aspect, right? So when you read that passage, and when you have a parallel passage, right, what we are mentioning is that we consider the historical context, both from Jesus' point of view and also the evangelist's point of view. And the third is like, what is the reader's current situation? Why is the author writing to the particular readers in that fashion or in that setting, or inserting that passage in the middle of something that's going on, right? So there are so many things that are happening when you are reading a passage. You are considering the reader's consideration, you are considering the writer's consideration, you are also considering the Jesus context and everything. So, but at the end of the day, what is the fundamental message that we can take from a passage? Is it the historic context, like, okay, this is addressing to that people, and that's what it says, that's it? Or are we saying that this is what it talks about the Lord, and this is what the Lord is trying to tell? Or is it like, hey, because this is happening to them, that is it's taken for us? What exactly is the sequence of things that I need to keep in mind when I read the passage? If this much of context is what is going on, sometimes I get carried away, right? Okay, I need to think only in the evangelist point of view, and he is writing to such and such an audience, right? And sometimes I do carried away by what I learn about Jesus from that. Oh, Jesus said this, so it must be the most important truth to even for me. Sometimes it seems that, okay, it's only for them, it's not for me, anything. How do you judge what we need to extract exactly by applying these things? Anything comes to your mind, like, okay, first thing is this, second thing is that? I'm just asking, I'm just thinking, I don't have the answer. I'm just thinking loud along with all of us. It's not that I know it.
Yeah, I too don't know that, but one example that comes to my mind, which happened just last week, is a Islamic friend, Googler, posting in one of the Christian groups, asking what is the meaning of, does the Bible mean anything at all when Jesus says that, the whole thing about divorce, only adultery can lead to divorce, but not otherwise. And basically he was going through a divorce himself, and he was married to a Christian lady, apparently a born again lady, and she is seeking a divorce, and this guy was like asking, Jesus said the only divorce can happen if they are involved in infidelity, otherwise not. But this lady is seeking divorce for reasons outside of other than infidelity. So does it still make sense, and what does the thing mean? So there was a lot of discussion. Naturally, a lot of Christians try to defend the viewpoint. But the moment we look at the script, the portion which they are quoting, it of course related to the Jews of those days. Jesus was talking to the Sadducees, and so it made perfect sense for them. Then there was Matthew writing to the Jewish readers, and it made perfect sense to them. Does it make sense to us today? And I think if you notice that Jesus kind of quotes that it is the hardness of human heart that allowed the divorce in the first place, but it was not so. And then he kind of connects it to the very beginning of the creation, when there was no law, no sin, and God created the man and woman to be united together. So that kind of tells us that probably there is a principle that was in place when the whole idea or the institution of marriage has come in, and that God never intended the man and woman to be separate once they are joined. So that kind of tells us that it was an eternal principle, which was given a little bit of leeway, because the only other thing that could happen if two people are married and they don't like each other is that one will kill the other, which we see often. So God said, okay, because you have your hardness of heart, give a divorce certificate and get going. But that was not so. Jesus clarifies it was not so from the beginning of the world. That was a timeless principle. So there are most of the times when Jesus gives out a parable or a saying or a clarification, he kind of gives a timeless principle which is, I think, the main takeaway for most of the time. We have to look for the timeless principle probably. I mean,
that's very, very just.